Our first speaker for academic session 2 is Dr. Matthew Mccartney. Dr. Matthew is Associate Professor at Oxford University. He is currently working as an independent researcher in India. He has been Director of South Asia Program at Oxford University. He has taught at multiple universities in South Korea, India, Pakistan, China, and others. He is currently writing a book on CPEC, which is going to be published by Cambridge University Press. Dr. Matthew will be joining us online.
Personal, Amin, the executive director, to Mariam, thanks to Mariam Lodi, who's dealt with a lot of the administrative issues. So I've been visiting Pakistan regularly for the last 20 years. So I know Pakistan well. It's become something of a second home to me. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to visit Pakistan for the last 2 years. So I'm very pleased to see, I'm hoping obviously to come soon, very pleased to see Pakistan getting back to normal. And it's lovely to see a conference taking place with, actual people sitting in a physical building. I was very pleased to see or to listen to Rafi Ullah Kakar's keynote presentation earlier today. I know Rafi very well from his time at Oxford, and he would be among the many friends in Pakistan that I would be looking forward to meeting when I come back to Pakistan in the near future. So my presentation, I won't dwell on the background to CPEC. I'm sure you're all very familiar, and various of the other presenters today have given the background, the costs, the dates, the geography. So my presentation today draws on some aspects of the book that the chair was very kind to mention. It's actually not being written. It was published earlier this year. The Dragon from the Mountains, the CPEC from Kashgar to Gwadar came out with Cambridge University Press. So I'm going to draw on some of the ideas from that book. Now, this book was 2 years I took to research it. To do the research, I was based in China, in India, in Pakistan, in Japan, and Oxford. But more kind of deeply, more broadly, the book is based on some 20 years of teaching about Pakistan, researching Pakistan, traveling in Pakistan, living in Pakistan. So my presentation, I'm going to structure it around 5 suggestions. How do we think about the likely impact of CPEC on the economy of Pakistan? I'm focusing on the economics rather than the geopolitics. So suggestions about how, as researchers, we should think about the impact of CPEC. The first of those suggestions is methodology. Now, we're not looking at a completed project that we have data on and we can look back and evaluate the impact of that project. We are undertaking a best guess about the likely impact of a project that is not scheduled for completion until 2030. So we need to be humble in our thinking. We're making guesses. We're not really undertaking rigorous research based on an existing body of data. So it's politicians who deal in hopes and promises. Economists should be dealing in theory and evidence. So we need to think very carefully about our methodology. How do we undertake research to evaluate the impact of a project which has not been completed? So we're guessing really about the future. And we need to think carefully about the Pakistan context. Pakistan does not have a successful record of completing international agreements. Pakistan, for example, has had some 22 agreements with the IMF and has failed to complete all but one of those agreements. Now, there's the added interest or complication here of the China factor. China has promised to engage with Pakistan over the long term, something very different with the fluctuating interests of the US and the IMF in Pakistan. And China does have a demonstrated track record of successfully building infrastructure. But China is different. China promises no conditionalities attached to its aid or its lending or its infrastructure program. So China is not going to be giving infrastructure conditional on Pakistan's governance improving, for example, as do the World Bank or the IMF. And poor governance, is perhaps one of the very things that needs to be improved in Pakistan in order for CPEC infrastructure to have a positive impact on the economy. Second suggestion is that I would suggest that researchers don't be distracted by dramatic maps. I included a few in my book, and it's easy to look at a map of CPEC and come away with the conclusion that this is a historically bold and dramatic project. In reality, CPEC is not a very big project by any kind of international comparison. CPEC in 15 years is promising to build about 2,000 kilometers of railways, about 1,000 kilometers of roads, so 15 years. In slightly more than 10 years, China built almost 30,000 kilometers of high-speed railway network. In 40 years in the US, in the 19th century, the US built almost 200,000 kilometers of railways. Quite recently, India has built almost 14,000 kilometers of highways in 10 years. So CPEC, so the physical infrastructure, it's not a very big project by any kind of international historical comparisons. Don't be deceived by maps in thinking about the size of CPEC. Be realistic about the size of CPEC. Thirdly, as researchers, we need to learn from history in thinking about CPEC. Now, CPEC is a project, an ongoing project that is not scheduled for completion for another decade or so. But there are a huge number of big infrastructure projects around the world that have been completed, for which there exist very rigorous economic studies looking at their impact. And it's very rare that researchers of CPEC draw on this enormous number of studies of big infrastructure projects. Now, the conclusions from these studies show that infrastructure can have all sorts of impacts on economic development. It can have positive impacts, it can have negative impacts, it can have minimal economic impact. So give one concrete example, roads and railways running from China through Pakistan. This could have very little impact on Pakistan if those roads are primarily used for transit, to take goods from China through Pakistan for export from Gwadar or elsewhere to the rest of the world. They may have a negative impact on Pakistan's manufacturing and industry if that infrastructure is used primarily to import goods from China that pose a competitive threat to Pakistani industry. They may have a positive impact on Pakistan if those roads and that infrastructure encourage domestic industrialization in Pakistan, leading to exports and employment. And at the moment, looking at the evidence over the last 7 or so years since the start of CPEC, it seems to be the case that the infrastructure and also trade agreements are primarily facilitating the import of goods from China. Since the advent of CPEC, imports from China have risen from about $4 to about $16 billion, and exports from Pakistan to China have shown no increase. They are no higher today than they were 7 years ago, about $2 billion at the start of CPEC. But how the impact of CPEC projects over the longer term, we need to think carefully about methodology, we need to use theory, we need to use evidence, we need to carefully consider under what circumstances does infrastructure and energy lead to industrialization, lead to exports, and lead to employment growth. The fourth suggestion is that we need to think very carefully about the context, the economic context of Pakistan, and ask the question, will CPEC tackle the crucial constraints that exist to economic growth in Pakistan? And for this, there does exist a lot of statistical, econometric, and survey evidence from the Pakistan context. So it's, I think, quite evident that the energy part of CPEC will tackle what has become a serious constraint to growth, economic growth in Pakistan. But if we look back to the 1990s and 2000s, in Pakistan, when energy shortages were far less serious, we can see that energy, the availability of energy, is not enough to generate rapid and sustained economic growth in Pakistan. Now, firm-level survey from Pakistan shows that roads and railways are not a principal constraint. Firms do not regard the poor quality of roads and rail in Pakistan as a principal constraint to their growth and investment. Much greater constraints in Pakistan are the state of education, particularly vocational education, the absence of long-term credit for industry, and the legal framework protecting investors' property rights. Now, these are more important constraints on economic or firm-level growth in Pakistan, and they are not those areas that are going to be addressed by CPEC. And to give you one kind of very personal example, I've been working with a UK university for the last 6 months. The university are very keen to set up some partnerships with universities in Pakistan. They want to build master's programs, undergraduate programs in a collaboration in areas like engineering and project management, exactly those types of vocational skills that are in relative short supply and would be invaluable for the functioning of CPEC. Now, unfortunately, this UK university is abandoning this effort to engage with Pakistan universities because the Higher Education Commission doesn't reply to emails. The university is going to go to another developing country. And that is a personal example of kind of a basic failure of governance in Pakistan, something that is not going to be addressed by CPEC. Number 5, we as researchers, we need to think more carefully about the economic development of China. What is going on in China? We talk a lot about China's grand vision for the Belt and Road Initiative, but we give much less attention to internal economic dynamics within China, in particular Western China, that part of China which is going to be joined to Pakistan, Xinjiang in particular, that is going to be joined to Pakistan through the CPEC infrastructure. Xinjiang has a population of only 23 million people. It largely has an agricultural base, but importantly for Pakistan, the Chinese government are making a huge effort to promote the textile industry in Xinjiang. So Xinjiang is not going to be a big market for exports of textiles from Pakistan. It is much more likely going to be demanding raw cotton from Pakistani farmers. So tying closer relationships with Western China are not going to be really going to be stimulating industrialization in Pakistan. They're more likely to stimulate the growth of agriculture in Pakistan. So to kind of summarize my 5 suggestions, that as economists, we need to thinking about CPEC, we need to think carefully about theory, we need to think carefully about evidence, we need to think carefully about the Pakistan context, and we need to be asking that question, under what circumstances does big infrastructure have a positive, transformative effect on employment, industry, exports, and technology transfer? And as a kind of summary, really, of the findings in my book, I believe that CPEC is going to have a positive impact on Pakistan's economy, but I would agree with Rafi Kakar from his keynote this morning that it's not going to be a game changer. It's not going to transform Pakistan's economy. CPEC is costed at about $60 billion. There are other estimates over 15 years. That's about $4 billion a year on average. Now, Pakistan has a GDP of about $270 billion. And in a typical year, Pakistan invests about $30 or $40 billion in its domestic economy. So the addition of $4 billion a year, it's an increase of maybe 10%, is not a transformative increase in investment. Now, I'm not pessimistic about CPEC. I believe it will have a positive impact. But the reason I don't believe it will transform Pakistan's economy is that we are really forgetting about what Pakistan has achieved over the last 70 years. In 1947, Pakistan was a very poor developing economy. 99% of its exports were agricultural products or raw materials. Some 80% of its economy was accounted for by agriculture. Virtually all of its exports went to India. Its industrial structure was very low, very simple, very low technology. By the 1990s, Pakistan's economy had been transformed. 80% of its exports were manufactured goods. Pakistan has experienced 70 years of average growth of about 5% per year. It's not a miracle economy, but it's actually a kind of forgotten success story of Asia and developing countries more generally. Compared to the position of Pakistan in 1947, 70 years of 5% average growth is a comparative economic success. So Pakistan in 2020, it's a middle-income country. It has a GDP of $270 billion. It is too big, too industrialized for $4 billion a year of CPEC to make a transformative impact. So I'm not pessimistic about Pakistan. It's because I'm optimistic about Pakistan, because I note its relative economic success over the last 70 years, that I do not believe CPEC, though positive, I do not believe CPEC will have a transformative impact on Pakistan's economy. So thank you, Chair. Thank you, audience. I'll draw to a halt there.